develop practice, massive practice, of using this control mechanism that allows them to choose the right language and ignore the other. And this is the same mechanism that is used in other situations that require selective attention. So again, something that has its roots in the language experience that is reflected outside language. And those examples that I gave you before involve ignoring cues that are potentially interfering and focusing on the dimension that matters. So if this is one of the reasons why we get these advantages, it follows that, as I was saying at the beginning, it doesn't matter which languages, because it's simply a question of switching off one language when you're speaking the other. So it doesn't matter how many people speak these languages, whether languages are spoken widely or only regionally or only by a handful of people. This is another very good reason to keep active all minority languages, whether they are introduced by immigration or whether they are spoken in particular regions, and encouraging early exposure in all children, in any language. Now, you may have heard the recent press about the potential longer-term advantages. Some studies suggest that even when you are in your in old age, you may benefit from bilingualism if you've kept using all your languages throughout your life. Apparently there are studies that the more languages were spoken in life, the better cognitive functions are maintained. So short-term memory, for example, a correlation has been found between number of languages and cognitive abilities in old age. And certain kinds of dementia are developed on average 4 years later. This is an enormous time. I mean, if the result is upheld, and it's a provisional result, this would have enormous consequences from the point of view of, think of public health, for example. We are personally contributing to these. We are planning to study the mental abilities of elderly bilingual speakers in the Western Isles, where it's a very tight community, and we want to see whether the people, elderly people who have dementia or don't have dementia, when they develop the symptoms, and whether there is any correlation with their language use throughout their lives. Disadvantages, a few temporary disadvantages, not in all children. So the fact that some children start speaking later, but still within normal bounds. The fact that bilingual children tend to have, all other things being equal, a smaller vocabulary in each language, partly because they learn, in some bilingual situations, they learn their languages in different contexts. And although if you count the number of words across languages, they typically know more words than a monolingual child. So the best time to raise a child bilingual is as early as possible, if there is an opportunity. It doesn't make any sense to wait until the first language is well established, because that actually deprives the child of language input in the most crucial years. And it might be more difficult to change the situation later on. And that, because bilingual children need input in both languages, so it's not enough to be native speakers of different languages, input is necessary, then this takes some effort, some consistency in the family, or some planning to expose the child to another language in a systematic way outside the family. So education in the foreign language from the preschool years actually increases the amount of input heard in the language. It's not the only way, but it's a way. And there are many patterns of bilingual input, not just in bilingual families, children from birth, but also later on. And there is no magic way of ensuring that your child becomes bilingual, but any method works if it provides enough input in both languages. And some methods may suit some families better than others. So minority language at home, majority language outside the home, one parent, one language, majority language at home, minority language at school. That's another method. So there is no magic one. Perceptions of minority languages are important. Children are very sensitive to what people think. Unfortunately, in Britain at least, there are two kinds of bilingualism. The prestigious kind and the less prestigious kind. And from a cognitive point of view, it shouldn't make any difference. But the bilingualism that involves the Urdu is not regarded in the same way as bilingualism that involves French. And children know this. They're very sensitive to whether a language is considered to be unimportant or less important, and that's why it's important for children to realize that any message can be expressed in any language. Both languages can be used, are valued both by the family and the community, and both languages can be used in all situations. Child second language learners also benefit from the advantages of bilingualism. So exposure to another language in the primary school years, first of all, is more likely to lead to active bilingualism, but also many studies have shown that, that child second language learners actually benefit from the cognitive advantages of bilingualism. We have looked at older children in a large-scale project where we tested 167 children in school-age children, and we found, by looking at this large cohort of older bilingual children, we found that monolingual and bilingual children don't really differ substantially in their language behavior. They tend to make the same developmental mistakes, and most of the errors that are typical of bilinguals, but are found also to a lesser extent in monolingual children, have to do with the process of handling two languages and not to incomplete or inadequate knowledge of the language. So their mental grammar is absolutely fine. Sometimes they fail to coordinate different kinds of information. So we are in a position to predict some of the errors that bilingual children and then bilingual adults can make. So the structures that require the coordination of different sources of information tend to be the most difficult, if you want, although what we see is variation. We don't see that bilinguals always get these structures wrong. They get them right too. And the effects of one language over the other can also be predicted. And typically what we find, interestingly, is that language A affects language B, but not the other way around. So you have to look at the relationship between the two languages in order to predict the direction of transfer effects from one language to the other. Let me say something. How much time do I have? Oh, okay. Well, I'll skip a bit this part then. If you look at adult second language learning, I've been talking about bilingual children. What about adult second language learning? There is a traditional tendency to focus on limitations. Okay? So adults, of course, they're worse than children, aren't they? Of course, adults can't reach a very high level. But when you look at achievements, actually, you discover a different picture. So cognitive neuroscience research, for example, that looks at people's brains, has actually shown that level of proficiency attained in adult second language learning is more important than age of first exposure. So for the late bilinguals who achieve high proficiency, the patterns of brain activation are similar between native speakers and non-native speakers. So level of proficiency seems to be the key. Recent research has shown that your brain is very flexible. So your brain grows early gray matter even when you start learning a language later in life. So that yellow spot is actually a growth of a benign growth of gray matter in the cortex in response to the experience of acquiring a second language to a high level. Now, I don't know if I have time just to give you a flavor of a recent research that we've done. So this is a test of attention that I want you to try briefly. So there are 3 levels. One is this. This is very easy.
Elevator task. Count the tones and say how many.
How many?
Try this example first. Ready? How many?
Not very difficult. Okay. Now, let's do this. Count only the
Elevator
low
task
tones,
with
but
distraction.
ignore the high tones.
Count the low tones and ignore the high tones. Try this example first. Ready? How many? Okay,
You're all
now
right.
try another example.
Now, the most difficult condition is this. So you keep counting the tones up if you hear a high tone, but you start reversing and scaling down if you hear a low tone.
Elevator task with reversal. Count the tones and reverse count as necessary. Listen to this example. Ready? Which floor?
Are you a bit confused?
Try this example first.
Okay, this was just to give you a flavor of the kind of tasks that can be used. Bilinguals usually perform better, right, in the third task and in the second task. Now, we used this task in two studies. One where we looked at exposure to a language in early childhood as opposed to late childhood. So we had students who had acquired a second language before the age of 3 and students who had acquired a second language before the ages of 4 and 15. We tested them as adults, okay? And what we found, just to summarize the research, is that all bilinguals are better than monolinguals, and there are no significant differences in performance with this task between early and late bilinguals. So that's good news. What about adulthood? So we tested people who had learned a language after the age of 14, so and later. All bilinguals had started late, and what we find is interesting. By using exactly the same task, we find that all bilinguals are better than monolinguals again, but the advantage is significant only for the second task, but not for the third. So the second task was the intermediate one, the intermediate difficulty one, where you had to ignore the high tones and focus only on the low tones. Okay? But the third task, this time we don't find any difference between late bilinguals and monolinguals. So some of these advantages seem to be there even when you learn a language. We need much more research. In fact, this is an area where we still have more questions than answers, whether these cognitive advantages are found in highly proficient bilinguals, such as the one that we study in Edinburgh. In Edinburgh, we focus on near-native speakers, exceptionally talented speakers who reach a very, very high level of competence, even if they may have an accent. We don't look at phonology. And what we find, again, is that the grammar and the vocabulary in these speakers are as good as native speakers, in some cases even better. But again, most of the errors that we find, the residual errors at this level, are due to not to incomplete knowledge of the language, but to some processing mistakes, okay, in real-time use of the language. So structures that require the coordination of different sources of information, for example, the choice of pronouns and context. So when to use certain kinds of pronouns, that depends on evaluating the context, evaluating